Okay, let's unpack this. We've all felt it. It's that specific draining exhaustion that sets in when your mental capacity just hits zero, but the social demands, like, they just keep coming.
Right.
Someone asks for just one more favor, one more meeting, or maybe just a quick response to a late night text. And you know intellectually that you need to protect your time and energy.
Hmm.
But instead of saying no, the word yes just kind of pops out, and then immediately you're hit with this wave of resentment, fatigue, and maybe even that sort of lingering shame that you've failed some invisible social contract.
That feeling of moral failure or, intense selfishness when you try to assert a necessary boundary is it's probably the most common psychological conflict in the modern world.
Right.
Our deep dive today is built on a very specific mission. We're going to use neuroscience and cognitive science to completely redefine that experience for you.
We want to know exactly why setting a boundary can feel like a personal character flaw instead of just necessary system maintenance. Your sources make the core premise crystal clear. Boundaries aren't barriers. They're essential infrastructure for human function and, kind of counterintuitively, for relationship health itself.
The scientific consensus on this is definitive. Our brains are, for all intents and purposes, still fundamentally tethered to these deep evolutionary thresholds for how much social and cognitive processing we can handle in a day.
But our environment has completely changed.
Completely. The environmental architecture of modern life, which is driven overwhelmingly by digital communication and 24/7 availability, has radically transformed the level and pace of social interaction.
Yeah.
And that creates this exhausting mismatch.
So it's that structural change, that shift from, let's say, elective social engagement to perceived social obligation. That's what creates the systemic stress and the resource depletion that forces us into this perpetual need for system maintenance. So we're conducting a deep dive into the neurological, the cognitive, and the physiological costs of these relentless modern social demands. We'll be using concepts like cognitive overload, ego depletion, and the chronic stress response cycle. And our goal is to use this science to reframe boundaries as absolutely essential maintenance for what we can call our social neuroecology. Let's start by just quantifying the problem, the sheer volume of it. Our sources confirm that modern life forces us to operate under these unprecedented social demands, and it's largely driven by the expectation of constant availability.
That's the critical starting point. I mean, if you want to understand why you feel constantly scattered, you really have to look no further than the ubiquitous digital device in your pocket,
The smartphone.
the smartphone. The omnipresence of technology is the most measurable driver of attention fragmentation we face. And look at the data. The average American checks their smartphone a staggering 96 times a day.
96. So if you do the math on that, that means we are experiencing an interruption or a self-initiated check about once every 10 minutes of waking life.
Once every 10 minutes. That number, it represents the baseline level of cognitive disruption we're all dealing with, whether we're trying to do focused work, engage socially, or even just attempting to rest. It shows how our attention has become, atomized. We're constantly ready to switch, and that readiness itself is incredibly costly.
And what's crucial here is that this isn't an accident, right? It's by design. These digital platforms, they don't just happen to be distracting. They use what researchers call persuasive design and even dark patterns. I mean, they're sophisticated psychological architectures engineered to maximize your engagement.
They absolutely are. They leverage very specific neurological vulnerabilities. They use variable rewards like the infinite scroll on social media or the randomized social feedback you get. Will this post get 2 likes or 200?
Right, the slot machine effect.
It's a slot machine for your social brain. It keeps the reward pathway activated, anticipating that next dopamine hit. And this taps directly into our deepest needs for novelty and, even more importantly, for social validation. They exploit the core human need for acceptance, keeping our attention perpetually divided and sort of externalized.
When you look at the structure of this constant demand, especially in a professional context, it becomes quite chilling. That constant requirement for digital availability, whether it's notifications from personal texts or platforms like Slack or Teams, it constitutes this new, pervasive form of interpersonal demand that has no clear off switch.
And this is what some researchers have termed digital panopticism. We should probably pause on that concept for a moment.
Yeah, break that down for us.
So the original panopticon was a prison design where inmates felt they could be watched at any time, which forced them to self-regulate their behavior constantly.
Okay.
In the digital workplace, this translates to the feeling that you are constantly being monitored or judged or required to perform.
So it's not even that someone is always watching, it's the belief that someone could be watching or will be checking the status of your last message or what time you signed off Slack. That forces us into this state of chronic, low-level performance anxiety.
Precisely. This constant performance and availability requirement, it operates on a micro scale.
Hmm.
Just a ping, just a status update. But the cumulative cognitive effect is massive. It creates a systemic deficit in deep, uninterrupted cognitive time because you've internalized the need to always be ready to respond. And that is the absolute antithesis of focused thought.
And this chronic readiness to switch brings us straight to the great myth of modern productivity, multitasking. We love to tell ourselves we're highly efficient, juggling those 96 checks a day, plus our actual complex workloads. But the evidence from your sources suggests what we call multitasking is actually rapid task switching, and it's anything but a neutral activity.
It incurs a measurable cost that is often totally invisible to us. This is the switch cost. Every single time your attention shifts, say, from an analytical report to a message about a colleague's birthday, your brain has to execute this entire command sequence just to reorient.
So it's like a mental reboot.
It is. And it lights up the frontoparietal control network and the dorsal attention network significantly. You are literally burning cognitive resources faster just to manage the switch itself, and that's before you've even processed any information from the new task.
So we think we're being efficient, but functionally we're just making our brains do all this unnecessary administrative work. And that inefficiency, I imagine, just wreaks havoc on our working memory.
Absolutely. Working memory, which is the system that holds the information you're actively manipulating, has very, very limited capacity. When you rapid switch, the brain has to retrieve the context of the new task, suppress the old one, and then configure the new task set. This rapid forced retrieval creates what scientists call cognitive bottlenecks, where your processing slows dramatically.
And that's when you make mistakes.
That's when you make mistakes, miss details, and your retention just plummets.
This sounds exhausting just to talk about it, but the most alarming finding in the sources about task switching is this concept of attention residue. Could you explain what that lingering cost entails?
Attention residue is it's the residual neural activation from the previous task that literally interferes with the present one. So you may have consciously shifted your focus, but a part of your brain is still processing that old task.
Like an echo.
It's like a cognitive echo. Often it's involuntary. You're still worrying about the unfinished email or that difficult conversation you just had. And the research on this is overwhelming. It indicates that it takes an average of 23 minutes and 15 seconds, to be precise, to regain full, deep focus after a single significant interruption.
23 minutes. So if you're being interrupted or self-interrupting every 10 minutes because of that digital panopticism we just discussed, then the math here is just brutal.
It is.
By definition, you are never achieving a sustained state of full, focused attention. You are perpetually operating in a state of cognitive recovery.
And that inability to ever truly settle into deep processing, that has long-term structural implications for the brain. If your brain is constantly training itself for shallow, fragmented interactions, what happens to the circuits that are designed for complex thought?
They get weaker.
They get weaker. Studies suggest that frequent switching can actually weaken the neural pathways required for deep processing and sustained attention.
Is that reversible? I mean, when we talk about weakening circuits or even decreased gray matter volume, that sounds really serious.
It is serious, but it is a dynamic system. The connection is correlational, but it's significant. Prolonged, nonstop multitasking has been linked to decreased gray matter volume in attention-regulating areas, specifically the prefrontal and parietal cortices.
And gray matter is where the processing happens.
That's where the neurons reside, process information, make connections. So a decrease suggests the structural efficiency for sustained attention is degrading. The architecture of modern life is, in essence, training our brains for persistent distraction, which makes it harder to establish and maintain focus even when we desperately want to.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. We've established this isn't a personal failing, it's an environmental one. It's built into the architecture of overload that just surrounds us.
Absolutely. The structure of modern work consistently favors availability over deep attention. If you think about environmental cognitive costs, just consider the open plan office.
Oh, I know this one.
Right. It was intended to promote collaboration, but the research showed that background conversation above 55 decibels, which is about the noise level of a quiet suburban street, lowers analytical task accuracy by 10 to 15%. These environments are actively reducing the cognitive bandwidth you have available for complex problem solving.
And so many of us thought escaping the open office for hybrid work would solve the problem, but it seems we just swapped physical interruptions for digital ones that are maybe even more insidious.
That is precisely what the data shows. Studies found that the constant monitoring of chat platforms, even when you aren't directly interrupted, significantly increases perceived stress by 14% and decreases your self-rated productivity by 11%. The cognitive effort required to simply monitor the threat of an interruption is a resource drain in itself.
This constant blurring of the lines, it creates what the sources call boundary erosion. And it really emphasizes why recovery time has to be treated as essential maintenance, not some kind of luxury.
Recovery time is completely non-negotiable for cognitive restoration. A study focusing on remote work showed that employees who checked digital communication after hours, even for just a few minutes, showed double the rate of attentional fatigue the following morning. Double. The lack of a clear boundary between work and life doesn't just make you tired. It incurs a measurable cognitive deficit that compromises your ability to function efficiently the next day. Your brain needs that uninterrupted recovery time to consolidate memories, clear out metabolic waste, and reset the networks required for directed attention. If you don't set boundaries, you are guaranteeing a performance failure the following day.
So the lack of a boundary isn't a testament to your flexibility or your dedication. It's a measurable, avoidable deficit that you incur the next day, which leads to needing even more resources to perform even simple tasks.
And moving from the cognitive load of all that rapid switching, we really need to address the metabolic cost of social interaction itself. We often forget that just managing a social persona is intensely demanding, especially when that interaction requires self-control or emotional suppression or decision-making.
This brings us to a really foundational concept in social psychology and neuroscience. Ego depletion. It sounds purely psychological, but the core idea is actually rooted in a resource expenditure model.
That's right. The energy model of executive function suggests that self-control, decision-making, and emotional regulation, they all rely on a single, limited resource.
Like a battery.
Think of it less like a muscle that gets stronger with use and more like battery life. Every act of volition, every time you choose to override a natural impulse or regulate a strong emotion or just manage the impression you're making on others, depletes this resource, leading to what we call ego depletion.
And modern social life, especially with this constant digital performance, is basically a high-intensity workout for this one limited resource. We're constantly regulating, right? Suppressing frustration with a client, managing the appearance of competence on a video call, or carefully crafting a polite text when we're actually furious.
The complexity of social life today demands incredibly high levels of self-regulation. And when this resource is significantly depleted, the consequences are profound and they're predictable. We see impaired decision-making, a strong tendency toward passive decision-making.
What does that mean, passive decision-making?
It means you start defaulting to social scripts. Instead of asserting a complex, personalized need, you just go with the flow. And you also have a reduced capacity to manage your own negative moods.
Can you elaborate on what this resource actually is? Is it like literal energy?
Well, that's where the scientific debate has added a lot of critical depth. Early models focused heavily on the glucose hypothesis, suggesting the resource was literal metabolic energy, like blood sugar.
Okay.
And while that original model has faced some challenges and nuance, the core concept remains incredibly robust. Executive function operates with a limited bandwidth. It's not infinitely replenishable in the short term. There's a famous analogy that executive function is like the cavalry in an army. High-impact operations are strictly limited in number and require fresh resources.
So if you spend your cavalry budget managing 96 digital inputs and endless small social obligations,
You have nothing left for the crucial task of setting a boundary later in the day.
this scarcity model helps us dramatically in understanding the pathology of people-pleasing, which is really the ultimate form of self-regulatory failure in a social context. The people-pleaser is just constantly expending these resources to manage the emotions of other people.
Exactly. People-pleasing is a profoundly maladaptive behavioral pattern. It's fundamentally rooted in an intense, often subconscious, fear of rejection and an overwhelming need for external validation. The prevalence is just staggering. Almost 70% of adults may struggle with this pattern at some point. And critically, over 60% of people-pleasers report experiencing severe burnout, which is the neurological payment for this constant expenditure.
So if the intention of a people-pleaser is usually to preserve harmony and be liked, why is it so physically, mentally, and cognitively difficult for them to just say no when they know they should? Why does the rational part of the brain seem to fail in that crucial moment?
This is due to a measurable neural mechanism called PFC-Amygdala decoupling. The interaction between the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, and the amygdala is central to decision-making under stress.
Okay, so the PFC is the rational brain.
Right, it's responsible for rational thought, calculating long-term consequences, and self-regulation. And the amygdala is your primary fear and anxiety center.
So what happens when that fear of social rejection kicks in?
When a people pleaser is faced with potential social conflict, like the possibility of disappointing someone by setting a boundary, the amygdala triggers a powerful primitive fear response. In this scenario, it often manifests as the fawn response, which is appeasement through compliance.
You just agree to make the threat go away?
Exactly. And crucially, as the amygdala fires up, activity in the PFC, the rational part, diminishes. It decouples.
So the fear literally incapacitates the rational brain at the exact moment it's needed most.
Precisely. It makes it physically and chemically difficult to access the cognitive processes you need to articulate and assert a personal need. The individual defaults to a state of automatic compliance, choosing the immediate low-effort path of saying yes to avoid the immediate high-intensity anxiety of potential conflict.
We often think of this as a character flaw, being weak-willed. But what you're describing is a structural compromise happening under stress. What's the long-term cost of operating this way?
The long-term cognitive toll is severe. By continuously prioritizing others' needs and avoiding conflict, the individual fails to use and therefore strengthen the neural circuits for self-prioritization and assertiveness. If you never exercise the no muscle, those pathways weaken.
Use it or lose it.
It's a neurological use it or lose it. This leads to a persistent state of hypervigilance, where the brain is constantly scanning for social threats, chronic overthinking about past and future interactions, and a deep-seated inability to set healthy boundaries. The compliant response just becomes the default neural habit.
What's fascinating here is how much the modern digital environment feeds and reinforces this people-pleasing dependency. It's constantly providing validation through what you called a neurochemical single.
The reward system is absolutely central to modern digital engagement. Digital notifications, likes, comments, these are fundamentally drugified social signals. They trigger an unexpected reward pattern that activates the exact same reward circuits, the ventral striatum and the nucleus accumbens, that evolved to detect survival-critical information, like finding food or achieving social status in a tribe.
So we're getting this potent, instant dopamine hit for checking an email or seeing a like, just as our ancestors would have gotten for finding a reliable water source.
That instantaneous, unpredictable dopamine loop powerfully reinforces dependency on instant gratification and, critically, on external validation. This dependency is a core driver of people-pleasing behavior. We seek that external input because it provides an immediate, predictable reward, which temporarily satiates the underlying anxiety caused by the fear of rejection.
But the sources indicate this is a rigged game that eventually leaves us feeling worse, not better.
It is. The system is designed for hyperstimulation. This chronic overexposure to digital stimuli leads to a phenomenon known as a chronic dopamine deficit state. In basic terms, the brain adapts to the unnaturally high and frequent levels of digital dopamine by downregulating its own receptor sensitivity and decreasing its natural dopamine transmission below your established baseline.
So when we sign off, the brain just crashes.
It crashes. Precisely. When the device is put away and the external stimulation ceases, your baseline dopamine level is lower than it was before the addiction began. This causes that familiar crash of irritability, boredom, or acute loneliness. We become biologically conditioned to seek more external input just to feel normal, which reinforces the cycle of checking, seeking validation, and further eroding our internal capacity for self-regulation and intentional solitude.
We've mapped out the cognitive and emotional costs. Now we need to get into the physical, the biological toll of constantly overriding your own needs to meet these high social obligations. Your sources draw a critical distinction that really clarifies this, the difference between chosen social time and obligatory social time.
This distinction is not just semantic, it's physiological. When your interactions shift from being elective, so chosen out of genuine desire, to being obligatory, perceived as a necessary requirement or even a threat, your brain initiates a powerful, high-cost physiological stress response.
What specifically triggers the highest level of stress here?
The most robust stress responses, the ones involving the highest and most sustained elevations of cortisol, are triggered by stressors involving what's called social evaluative of threat.
The fear of being judged.
The fear of being judged negatively, rejected, or losing status within your social group.
This is so deeply tied to our evolutionary need for tribal acceptance. So if a people pleaser says yes because they fear conflict, they are literally activating a primal high-cost threat response.
Exactly. Every single time we engage in people-pleasing behavior or accept an obligation out of fear of rejection or evaluation, we are triggering this high-cost threat response. Now compare this to prosocial behavior done purely out of compassion. That can actually be stress-reducing, but only if it's done without the expectation of return validation or social approval.
The moment it becomes about protecting your social self.
The moment the interaction becomes about preserving your social self under the threat of judgment, it becomes metabolically expensive and highly toxic to your system.
And if we keep triggering that threat response, constantly saying yes when we mean no, we enter a state of chronic stress. This fundamentally disrupts the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is the body's central regulator for the stress hormone cortisol.
And prolonged unnecessary activation of the HPA axis disrupts the negative feedback loop. Normally, when cortisol levels rise, they signal back to the hypothalamus and pituitary gland to shut down production. Chronic stress effectively breaks this signal. This leads to dysregulation. Abnormal cortisol levels, sometimes chronically high, sometimes flattened, and critically, it contributes to neuroinflammation and heightened pain sensitivity throughout the body and nervous system.
This direct physiological cost is why boundaries relate so strongly to physical health. You mentioned headache disorders specifically in the sources.
This chronic stress state is a critical element in the pathophysiology of common headache disorders. Stress is reported as a trigger for nearly 70% of migraine attacks, and the chronic HPA axis disruption contributes to the transformation of episodic headaches into chronic forms, like migraines and tension-type headaches. Cortisol and related inflammatory markers lower the pain threshold, which means everyday sensory input that was once tolerable now registers as painful.
So, neglecting your boundaries today doesn't just make you tired. It can literally be increasing your likelihood of developing chronic, debilitating pain down the road.
It's a vicious cycle that locks the body into a state of defense. And beyond the HPA axis, chronic stress causes autonomic nervous system imbalance, or ANS imbalance. This is characterized by sympathetic, that's the fight-or-flight dominance, coupled with reduced parasympathetic, or rest and digest function.
So the sympathetic nervous system is constantly running the motor way too fast.
Precisely. Sustained sympathetic activity increases muscle tone in the head, neck, and shoulders, a direct trigger for tension headaches. It also promotes vascular changes, an initial vasoconstriction followed by a rebound vasodilation, which are very closely linked to migraine initiation.
And the reduced parasympathetic function means we lose the ability to recover effectively, even when we try to rest. The critical vagus nerve, which regulates heart rate and our anti-inflammatory pathway, is impaired.
Correct. Decreased vagal tone weakens the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway, which perpetuates pain sensitization and contributes to the chronicity of these stress-related conditions. This ANS imbalance amplifies negative emotional states, causes cognitive rigidity, and significantly lowers the pain threshold, keeping the body in a persistent state of heightened pain and stress reactivity, all stemming from chronic social obligation.
This leads us to the most compelling and maybe counterintuitive finding from your sources, what we're calling the neural paradox. If chronic stress depletes our executive resources, that ego depletion we talked about, why do we become more compliant and pro-social when we're exhausted instead of just shutting down and protecting ourselves? It just seems illogical.
It does seem illogical from the perspective of self-interest, but it makes perfect sense from the perspective of social survival. This phenomenon really overturns that simple ego depletion means less self-control model. fMRI research shows that high cognitive load doesn't disrupt pro-social behavior. It actually enhances it. The brain is making a resource allocation decision.
Okay, help us understand that reallocation. What is the brain prioritizing over its own self-protection?
When your cognitive resources are severely taxed, the brain shifts activation away from the region associated with self-protection and self-awareness, the left insula, and to regions involved in mentalizing and social harmony.
The left insula is often associated with interoception, right? That sense of the internal state of your body. Am I tired? Am I hungry? Am I stressed?
Exactly. When the left insula is compromised due to cognitive load, your ability to accurately perceive your own physical and emotional state, and thus defend your own interests, diminishes. Instead, the brain upregulates the areas concerned with group harmony. the bilateral temporal parietal junction, or TPJ, and the right dorsolateral superior frontal gyrus. These regions are critical for theory of mind, the ability to mentalize, understand, and predict the needs and intentions of others.
So when our bandwidth is taxed and we are cognitively depleted, the brain structurally compromises our capacity to defend our own needs and interests, and it favors compliance prosociality as the path of least resistance.
That is the structural implication. Saying yes to maintain social peace is cognitively easier than mobilizing the substantial resources needed to articulate, defend, and manage the social fallout of a no. The depleted brain favors efficiency. It may feel easier in the moment, but it rapidly leads to further depletion and burnout. This demonstrates that boundaries aren't failing because you're morally weak. They are failing because your core neurological systems are prioritizing avoiding immediate social threat over long-term self-protection when you're under duress.
Okay, since we've established that boundaries are essential neurological maintenance and that our own internal systems are kind of designed to fail us under chronic load, we need science-backed strategies to protect that bandwidth. And we should start by clarifying a critical distinction that's often missed in pop psychology: the difference between intentional solitude and harmful isolation.
This is fundamental. We have to understand that they are biologically polar opposites. Isolation is a painful, unwanted state of social withdrawal and disconnection. Studies show isolation actively increases HPA axis activation and cognitive decline. It functions exactly like chronic, toxic stress.
Okay.
Intentional solitude, however, is a positive, chosen, and necessary state. It is a physiological requirement for long-term neural health.
So how does choosing to step away help the brain actively recover from the constant demands of social processing?
Intentional solitude allows the brain to switch off the externally focused task-positive network, or TPN, which manages concentration and interaction, and switch on the default mode network, the DMN.
And the DMN isn't just a rest network, right?
Not at all. It's a network that's active during self-reflection, autobiographical memory processing, and meaning-making. This is the network that helps you clarify your core identity and your long-term goals.
So if we are always in the TPN, always responding to those external demands, we are systematically starving the DMN of the time it needs to consolidate who we are and what we actually value.
Exactly. The DMN requires uninterrupted time to function optimally and clarify your values. Without intentional solitude, your sense of self begins to erode, which makes it even harder to identify and assert necessary boundaries later on. Solitude provides the time and space necessary to rebuild that sense of self.
And beyond choosing mental solitude, we can also restore bandwidth by using specific environments, which brings us to the very practical framework of attention restoration theory, or RT.
RT posits that cognitive recovery is accelerated through exposure to environments that support effortless attention. Remember the concept of directed attention, the system that tires out under constant social demand. We need a way to replenish it without trying to force ourselves to rest.
And nature provides that mechanism.
Yes, natural settings provide softly fascinating stimuli. These are things like the movement of flowing water, the complex but non-threatening pattern of plant life, or the shifting light of the sky. These stimuli capture our involuntary attention. We don't have to force ourselves to focus on them.
And because it's involuntary.
Because the attention is involuntary, the directed attention system, the executive system, is allowed to rest and replenish its mental resources.
The evidence for this restorative power is stunning. It goes far beyond simple relaxation.
It is quantifiable. One foundational study looked at surgical patients recovering in hospital rooms. Those with views of greenery or trees, compared to patients with views of a city, stayed 0.8 days shorter in the hospital and required 22% less pain medication.
Wow.
Nature is not merely pleasant or relaxing. It is a profound physiological rest mechanism for the brain that directly lowers stress responses and pain thresholds. Therefore, exposure to nature should be viewed as essential system maintenance, not just leisure.
So now we need to translate the science into practical implementation. We need to move away from just hoping we feel strong enough to say no, to setting up our environment for success so our neurological systems don't have to work so hard in the first place.
The first step is to practice what we can call energy matching. If your executive functions, the ability to process complex ideas and critically set new boundaries, operate most efficiently in mental solitude, then we have to schedule our day accordingly.
This means resecting our own internal clock, not just external deadlines.
Absolutely. Do the most difficult decision-making, the most creative work, or any task that requires high self-regulation first when your cognitive resources are fresh. Attempting novel, complex tasks like Negotiating a new boundary when you are already ego-depleted is a recipe for that neural paradox to kick in, which guarantees failure through automatic compliance.
So you carve out these dedicated, distraction-free blocks for complex work and protect them fiercely from digital intrusion.
And that leads directly to communication boundaries, protecting ourselves from the constant attention fragmentation we discussed at the beginning.
This is non-negotiable system protection. We have to proactively limit the cost of switch tasking. This means setting clear device-free times, especially around sleep and meal times. We should use environmental tools like turning off all non-essential notifications or even setting your phone screen to grayscale to reduce the visual reward of notification badges, to protect the prefrontal cortex from unnecessary switch costs. A boundary here is a physical act of protection, not a verbal negotiation. And for those who might feel trapped in that people-pleasing cycle, constantly seeking the digital reward for validation, there's a strategy to recalibrate the reward system itself, the dopamine fast.
The goal of a dopamine fast is explicitly to reset your reward pathways and restore your social bandwidth. Since we established that chronic digital stimulation leads to a dopamine deficit state, we need a prolonged time out from high dopamine digital stimuli. This means deliberately stepping away from the main drivers: social media, streaming video, competitive gaming, and sometimes even constant news consumption.
How long does a reset like that typically take to see a measurable neural change?
While experts often suggest a duration starting with a minimum of 1 month is needed to address a chronic deficit state. This extended period allows the brain to increase its natural dopamine transmission back toward a healthy baseline and restore its receptor sensitivity. The goal is to regain the ability to enjoy modest, real-life social rewards, like a quiet conversation, reading a physical book, or a walk in nature, rather than relying solely on artificial, external digital validation.
And finally, we have to address that structural compromise we found in the neural paradox. We need to strengthen the no muscle, the prefrontal cortex itself.
Assertiveness training has to be viewed as neurological strength training. It's not just about learning scripts, it's about strengthening neural circuits through consistent use. When you learn to use the PFC to resist the immediate conflict avoidance triggered by the amygdala, you are building capacity.
What's a practical assertiveness approach that actually strengthens the PFC?
One effective technique is structured deferral combined with prioritization. Instead of a direct, anxious no, you use a structured response that buys time for the PFC to engage. For instance, that sounds important, but I am currently at capacity. I need 24 hours to review my priorities. What should we deprioritize to fit this in?
So you're forcing a rational calculation.
You're forcing rational calculation. It strengthens the circuit for self-prioritization, and over time, it weakens the neural pathway of automatic compliance. You are choosing the effortful path now to ensure your long-term well-being. So to synthesize the entire trajectory of this deep dive, we are fundamentally wired for connection, but the environment of modern life, characterized by unprecedented digital availability and the constant threat of social evaluation, has turned social interaction into a high-cost metabolic activity.
Yeah.
This perpetually risks ego depletion, systemic stress, and chronic health issues.
Right.
The solution isn't becoming antisocial or isolated. It's recognizing and respecting our non-negotiable cognitive and biological limits.
So what does this all mean? The core principle we've established today, and it's supported by hard neurological data, is this. Boundaries are not barriers to relationships. They are the necessary infrastructure, the neurological maintenance and stress management that allows your entire system to remain functional, healthy, and sustainably engaged for the long term.
If you view your energy as finite, your attention as atomized, and your ability to choose as a limited-time resource, then setting a boundary is simply an act of physiological responsibility.
Yeah.
It is the only way to ensure you have the bandwidth left to show up authentically for the people and tasks that truly matter most.
Here is the final provocative thought we want to leave you with. Consider the long-term impact of chronic sympathetic dominance and cortisol elevation on your HPA axis. If boundaries are system maintenance, neglecting them means you aren't just mentally exhausted today. You are actively increasing your susceptibility to future chronic health issues like heightened pain sensitivity, tension disorders, and stress-induced headaches. What essential maintenance task did you skip today? What boundary did you avoid setting that your brain will inevitably demand payment for tomorrow?